Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody for being here with us this afternoon. If you could see the others on the screen, you would know we have a large group of folks joining us today from many different disciplines and walks today, really eager to learn more about the American Rescue Plan Act. Before we jump into that, I would like to share with you that this is one of two events that my organization, Regional Opportunity Initiatives, and should have said Tina Peterson from Regional Opportunity Initiatives and Radius Indiana are sponsoring in the coming week, actually, about great opportunities in our state for both state and federal funding to support opportunities in our region. You will have seen, if you tuned in a little bit early here today, run across your screen the information about next week's events. They are both on the 9th, one at 9 o'clock in the morning and one at 12:30, and they will be about the Regional Economic Acceleration and Development Initiative, or READY. And we're looking forward to having the opportunity to visit with the folks from IEDC, both at the Mill in Bloomington on Wednesday morning and at French Lick in the Clifton Ballroom in the afternoon with Radius as well. So if you do not have information about those two events, you can find that at regionalopportunityinc.org, where you'll be able to register for one or both of those in-person events that are taking place next week. Today, however, we are very excited to be talking about the American Rescue Plan Act and to have with us Andrea Kern, who you will have seen is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Office of Community and Rural Affairs, a job that she's had since February of 2021, but she has been with OCRA now since 2018 and previously served as the Northeast region, Northeast region, which is 16 counties, not quite as big as our 11. Oh, I'm sorry, maybe that's bigger than our 11. Apparently I can't do math today. But prior to that, she worked as a preservation specialist and as a development consultant in partnership with Noblesville Main Street and Indiana Landmarks. She has a bachelor's degree from Indiana University, a master's of science from Ball State University, and we are super excited to have her here today. One of the few people we know that have read every single word of the final interim ruling on the American Rescue Plan Act. So very excited to have this opportunity because we as a region, the Indiana Uplands, will be receiving over these two tranches of funding, $29 million in our 11 counties and 48 cities and towns. And so, Andrea, please help us understand how we can go about using that most effectively. And by the way, one final word, as you have a chance today and you have questions, please put them into chat. We'll be monitoring those. This is going to be a long presentation and we have an hour. We'll answer as many questions as we can, but if we do not get to them all, we will send out answers to everyone that registered for the webinar. I'll also let you know that around slide 19, there's going to be a poll for you to respond to, and we will try to give you the results of that poll at the end of today's webinar. So, Andrea, thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm gonna take a second here and pull up my presentation. All right, hi everyone, I'm Andrea Kern and I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Office of Community and Rural Affairs. We are a state agency focused on the rural population in Indiana in the Lieutenant Governor's family of business. So we initially got kind of interested in the American Rescue Plan Act shortly after it was signed into law in March, and just what this opportunity meant for our rural communities. We were really quick to put out a survey to all of our local elected officials at the end of March and gave it a couple weeks, got a really amazing amount of turnout, and just could really see that our rural communities were struggling to both understand what this opportunity meant for them and also looking for somebody to be a leader to help them digest this information. So we have taken on that role at OCRA and trying to do presentations like this to help communities really understand what this funding means for communities, as well as what the whole American Rescue Plan Act could mean for them. So what is the interim final rule? So I will start with the fact that this guidance is interim. So this is subject to change, and the Treasury is still accepting comments on the guidance included here until July 16th. So we are more than likely to receive updated guidance, perhaps final guidance before around that same time period. So the American Rescue Plan Act is a $1.9 trillion relief bill. And not only the coronavirus local fiscal relief funds is one pot of funding within that federal stimulus act. So there are several other block grants, application grants, money directly, individual payments for households and child care support. So all of that is wrapped into the American Rescue Plan Act. And this interim final rule is just guidance related to that coronavirus local and state fiscal relief fund, which is one pot of funding within that, within the larger act. So we will be, communities will be receiving those funds in two tranches. 50% has been already released to the states and our counties and metro cities. The other 50% is going to be coming around a year later. And also non-entitlement units of government will receive their allocations around June of this year, depending on when they file the paperwork that they need to do to receive that funding. And so really, like I said, this is just a 150-page document. It would put you to sleep to go through it. So hopefully I can digest it well for you today. So overall, that coronavirus local fiscal relief fund, which is all we're going to be talking about today, is set up for you to address the impacts in four primary ways. These four very general ways, which we'll be going into detail for each one, are to respond to the public health emergency and its economic impacts, to respond to workers performing essential work, to replace revenue lost and or attributable to the pandemic, and to make investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. In that interim final rule, we also received some accountability and transparency requirements, which I will also go over in this presentation. But really what we can generally say about this is that the guidance does confirm broad latitude to use for relief needs, and some uses are specifically called out specifically. So there are certain uses for qualified census tracts, and these are not exhaustive, but they are essentially safe harbor uses. So the timeline, this is a really important thing for our communities to know, is that the funds must be obligated by the end of 2024 and fully spent by the end of 2026. So we do have time to be really strategic and think about the long game related to these funds. I know, I've kind of had this, been thinking a lot about how communities are responding to receiving these funds. And I think we've just spent the last year, doing things quickly and trying to just do the best with what we have. And I think communities are still in that very make quick decisions, quick allocations to things based on just the emergency of the pandemic. And I think this funding really gives our communities an opportunity to step back and think strategically and really plan for the best way to use these funds. I have outlined a number of restrictions, but I'll add that some of these restrictions have caveats. So, so you cannot deposit into pension funds, but there are situations where you could deposit into a pension fund. So if any of these things are things that you are interested in tapping into, I would say go to those pages within the interim final rule, because there's some additional guidance. But generally, these are the restrictions, and that if you do not follow the guidance, whatever the final guidance may be, you would have to repay the Treasury. So they haven't clarified how they're going to be auditing all of the communities that are set to receive these funds, but I imagine that based on the reporting requirements that they would have some, red flags of how the funds are being spent. And so that would be how they would audit those communities who may not be spending them in relation to the guidance. And also, if there are things that are in the interim final rule that do not make their way to the final guidance, but you spent those funds related to the interim final rule, that would not be an eligible expense. So again, I would be really cautious about making any, allocations at this time. I think it's just, you can be planning and creating committees around these funds, but it's a little bit early to be spending them. Okay, so some reporting requirements, and then I can't see the chat, but Lucy is our summer intern this year, and she is going to be putting some information related to how non-entitlement units of government can request their initial payment from this fund in the chat. So there are some links that will be really helpful for those non-entitlement units of government. So for the reporting requirements, our metro cities and counties will be required to submit an interim report, quarterly report, and excuse my dog. Non-entitlement units of governments will also submit reporting on these funds. So I grabbed this from National League of Cities, but I think it's a really great framework that I wanted to make sure everybody had. So while there are not, there are some example uses in the interim final rule, those are not exhaustive. So this 4-step framework to assess the eligibility for projects will help you or help our communities really decide whether what they're considering funding could be eligible for these funds. So really stressing the impact of COVID-19 on the activity, assessing the causal or compounding connection to COVID-19, and then if there is a disproportionate impact on distressed sectors or population. So there is some specific call outs for qualified census tracts, but if you can relate it to a specific census tract in your or in your region that had was more impacted by the pandemic, if you could support that in those reports, then you should be okay. And then determine how to prove the expense produces the expected outcome. So like I mentioned before, we are going to go through each of those 4 eligible uses and talk about how specifically you can expand on the very general area that it's covering. So to respond to the public health emergency, so this is very much related to the CARES Act. So it's really not any different than the CARES Act funding. So we're looking at COVID mitigation and containment, medical expenses for COVID related to COVID-19, behavioral health care, and then public health and safety staff. So responding to the public health and negative economic impacts that maybe you had additional human services that you needed to support, and that would all be related to this first eligible use. And then the second piece of that, or its negative economic impacts, including assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits, or aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. So one of the pieces that I specifically called out is that a reminder this is directly from the interim final rule, is that these eligible uses must respond to the negative economic impacts of the public health emergency and must be designed to address an economic harm resulting from or exacerbated by the public health emergency. So if you're considering whether a program or service would be eligible under this category, the recipient should assess whether and the extent to which there has been an economic harm, such as the loss of earnings or revenue that resulted directly from the COVID-19 public health emergency, and whether or not the extent to which this use would respond to or address the harm. So one of the areas here is that you wouldn't want to support an industry not already listed here, the tourism, travel, or hospitality, if you cannot draw a connection to COVID-19 as well as a relation to the tourism and travel industry. So there's a percentage of how impacted the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry is, and so you would have to relate. Let's say you picked out your I don't know, your business district, and you wanted to help fund them. You would have to prove that they were as impacted as that tourism, travel, and hospitality industry. So The first one, workers and families, assistance to unemployed workers, job training, loans and grants to small businesses. This technical assistance piece is one that we're really tracking and trying to find out more information and hoping that there's more information in the final guidance, but this could be technical assistance, counseling, or other services to assist with business planning needs. So this might be an opportunity for your local Main Street organizations to tap into these funds, chambers, anybody who provides technical assistance to your small businesses could be eligible to receive these funds as long as those organizations that receive them used that fund, whether that's staff support or whatever, to provide those services to the small businesses. So this one is definitely a piece we'll want to track as more guidance is released in the future. So, and then let's see here, the impacts to state, local, tribal governments. And we already covered the aid to impacted industries. So this one is the biggest area within all four of those eligible uses, I think, that has a lot of is left up to interpretation. So expect to see more guidance coming out on this piece specifically. So Treasury also released an FAQ at the same time that they released the interim final guidance. So I pulled this is a direct copy and paste, and I think will help communities kind of see what the goal truly is with these funds. But these are not general economic development or workforce development funds. So your recipients must demonstrate that the funding uses directly addresses a negative economic impact of the COVID-19 public health emergency. So can't be used for your, drawing a industry or company to your community, or let's say a streetscape project or something like that would not be generally not be allowable with these funds. So I know this font is maybe very small on your screen, but over here in the blue, we'll go into this in a minute, but I wanted to call out where these qualified census tracts are. So these are disproportionately impacted communities. These should be, you could use these, anything that's called out for qualified census tracts as an additional eligible use, you could use in an area that is not a qualified census tract as long as you proved that they were a disproportionately impacted community in your reporting. So that's something to note, that all of these additional uses that aren't expressly allowable generally could be allowable in your community if you did that extra qualified census tract research for your specific census tracts. And so that would include in this 11 county region, Lawrence County and the Bloomington MSA. So those express additional use would be related to addressing health disparities. So we could do lead line removals, community violence intervention programs, community navigators, housing and neighborhoods. So that a big one is that affordable housing development, housing vouchers, services to organizations that support individuals experiencing homelessness, addressing those educational disparities through services like tutoring or after school programs. And then lastly, promoting healthy childhood environments through high quality childcare, home visit programs, or services for child welfare involved families and foster families. All right, so do we have any questions at this time?
Yes, we actually have several. So we have a question about the timeline. Could you explain a little bit more about the difference between the obligated date and the performance date?
Yep, so obligated is you have a plan in place to spend those funds and then spent. So when you set up your account to receive those funds, everything that you do with those funds must be paid out of that account. So you can't transfer it to your general account and then pay out of that. So all of the funds have to be expended by the end of 2026 out of that specific account. I hope that answered your question.
I think so.
Okay.
Does this include impact to the workforce, i.e. Workforce shortage or labor shortage?
Yeah, it could be. So where the difference on this FAQ comment that was made, I think is, so if you wanted to support an existing workforce development program, you wouldn't be able to do that with these funds. But if you tied it to, new training for workers to get them back because they were unemployed due to the pandemic, I think that's just a finessing that you'll have to do at the local level.
Okay. Do you have, or do you know of anyone who has sort of a cheat sheet explaining the ARPA and all of its components?
Yeah, so there is a really great National League of Cities has an Excel spreadsheet that is kind of interactive that shows which agencies are receiving the funds, how to tap into them, as well as Bruce Katz, who is kind of an urbanist scholar from Drexel and the NOAC Finance Lab, has put together a federal stimulus guide. And Lucy, I don't know if you could, I know this is, you'll have to kind of think on the fly here, but if you could put that in the chat, that is another really great resource as well, and shows you who can apply for them and how to tap into that. So yes, those are two really great resources. We are also going to be, I'll just also add, are also going to be putting out a ARPA guide for communities within probably the next month or so, which will have kind of all of this information included. So look for that from our agency as well.
Okay, great. That will be wonderful. We'll definitely have to provide that link. Can you provide some clarity on administer economic relief programs?
So that would be economic relief programs. I think what you're asking with that question is related to like grants to small businesses. So it would be very similar to what we did with the CARES Act funds. OCRA was the recipient of those funds. And so you just have to prove that, the business was impacted by COVID-19 and that your support to them would be spent on operating expenses, staff salaries for job retention and business retention. Okay. Let me know if that doesn't.
One more question. We have one more question that I'm going to ask, and then I'll hold the other one until the end,
okay.
Because I think we're going to cover some of that. You mentioned housing vouchers. Can this be used for assistance in paying utilities that a household has fallen behind on due to being unemployed due to COVID?
Yes. Yep. That is an express use of these funds. It's related to utilities and rental assistance.
Okay. I think that will do us for the moment. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we'll move on to the next area, which is this premium pay to workers. So that is up to $13 per hour to eligible workers. And that could be either directly, so your city staff, county staff, state staff, or through grants to third-party employers. So I'm thinking like your healthcare workers or your mental health care workers who had to perform work that either touched objects that were handled by other people or had contact with other people. So when we're thinking about that, it specifically called out the meatpacking industry. And so how they had to show up to work when, there were huge outbreaks in that, like we saw in Cass County in Indiana, they were still showing up to work. So you could provide premium pay to those workers that went to work during that time. So there's some other ones here that they called out: janitors and sanitation workers, public health and safety staff, child care workers, educators, and then social service and human service staff as well. So this is direct payment to them. And then the next one, this is a big piece, is the reduction in revenue. So there is a formula within the interim final rule to determine what your revenue reduction is. So generally, this general revenue is based on the Census Bureau's definition and would include your revenue from taxes, your general revenue, and any kind of transfer that you would have between the state and local governments. So recipients cannot use their pre-pandemic projections as a basis to estimate their reductions in revenue. It has to be based on their actual fiscal year 2019 budget numbers. I'll also add that there are a number of communities that were flagged by AIM as having estimations that exceeded 75% of their budget. So within the actual American Rescue Plan Act, it does say that communities, local units of government cannot receive more than 75% of their annual budget for fiscal year 2019. And so that number is important, but those communities should already be aware of that and that their projections will have to be adjusted. I think that, you know, everything was happening very, very quickly. And so this has never been done before. And so the numbers that were based on CDBG and kind of the block grant formulas. And so this is a rapidly changing area, and why you have to do the non-entitlement units of government actually have to go in and request their funding. So you have a broad use of how you use the funds when you are using them for your revenue reduction. So it can support government services, and that includes, you know, health services, maintenance of infrastructure. So you could do road projects with this, modernization of cybersecurity, school and educational services, and support to your police, first responders, and other public safety services. So I think the best way to describe revenue reduction is if you use your ARPA funds last in your project, save it for your last resort. And then the revenue reduction should be because this should be your last resort because of all of the freedom that's within it. So let's say you had a water project that you were going to do, or a water park project that you were going to do in 2020, but you had to put that on hold because of the pandemic and allocate those funds somewhere else. You can now put the funds back in, or you could now outspend those funds on your water park project because it was something that was in your fiscal year 2019 budget. However, you should not work on that project until all COVID related community needs have been addressed. So you don't want to save this piece for last so that you're not tempted to spend it on something when you've got maybe, you know, more urgent needs in your community. So really assessing all of the needs of your community before you go back and put that money to your revenue reduction. And then the last one, this is a very broad area. So you don't have to tie the uses for water, sewer, or broadband to any pandemic related needs. So water, sewer, and broadband are already determined as having a COVID-19 related use. So they say that, you know, water is an important public health issue, sewer is an important public health issue, and then broadband. Generally, we saw from the pandemic the importance of broadband, and so there is no need for communities to do some additional reporting to tie those uses to COVID-19. You will not need to do that. So you can see here, I wanted to first focus on the water sewer piece. And this is one we're also still tracking and expecting to see changes on. So again, keeping with that, the general theme of this is to kind of hold off and wait for that final guidance. But these could be used for lead line service replacements, climate change and resiliency activities, and cybersecurity needs to protect your water and sewer infrastructure, but could be improvements at the distribution and storage systems, your building or upgrades, and transmission upgrades. So it explicitly outlines eligible uses aligned to EPA's the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So IFA has received, I think it's $100 million to do the same work. So I would be tracking that. I think they are planning to announce some more guidance on that piece before the end of the week. So, and then broadband, obviously our agency is really tracking this piece because we did receive $250 million from the state's ARPA allocation. So this guidance is something we are tracking, but also, if you're planning on doing broadband projects locally, you'll want to pay attention to this too, but this money should be used to provide service to unserved and underserved households and businesses. So those, the definition of unserved and underserved is anybody who has less than 25.3. You would have to, this is a big piece. They want the service to reliably meet one up, one down. So that is, it's 100 up, 20 down, with the ability to scale as well. And then they do have encouraged outlines. So consider affordability. So making that affordable for your community, doing digital inclusion projects. So the infrastructure is no good if you don't have people who are willing to use it. And should have physical broadband connection. So doing that last mile connection should be prioritized with these funds. This is another really great, actually, I'll do this last piece, but I also wanted to bring up the potential overlap with the pending American Jobs Plan Act. So I think we've all seen this in the news, but they're currently negotiating, anywhere between $800 million or $3 trillion, depending on the day, investment in jobs and infrastructure. This bill, what was put in, the White House released a fact sheet detailing the plans for the jobs plan, but this would include additional funding for water and broadband, repairing roads and bridges, and raising wages for caregiving workers. We want communities to be really strategic about how they spend this specific pot of money. And so if there are opportunities for your community to receive other funding to do any of these specific uses that might be in the American Jobs Plan, I would really hold off until you know that that is completely not going to happen and that there's not going to be funding available, because these funds are very flexible. And so if there are other opportunities for money, like, there is actually additional pay or premium pay somewhere else in the American Jobs Act. So if you can tap into that piece, I would do that through FEMA, sorry. So there is FEMA funding. And so that is a simple application that a community can fill out and still have that same impact on their community without tapping into this extremely flexible funding. So I think this would be a good time to pause and answer additional questions.
Okay, and we do have a couple.
Okay.
So do ENTs automatically count for salary reimbursement, or is there a minimum number of percentage of runs that are COVID related?
I don't know if that's in there, or I don't remember that. So
okay,
not sure.
And here's another one. Can ARP money be used to pay for the initial equipment needed for Starlink for underserved broadband areas?
Yes.
And then you've mentioned a couple of times that you're tracking some guidance that you expect to come down from the federal government. Will that new information be made available somewhere?
Oh yeah, so you could go to, and I might call on Lucy again to put another link in the chat, but the White House released a fact sheet related to the American Jobs Plan Act. I don't know when that's going to happen, but it's definitely going to happen this year. I think that's been made very clear, is that there will be some form of infrastructure bill within 2021. So whether there's consensus between the Republicans and Democrats, or the Democrats push through the $3 trillion plan, I think that's yet to be seen, but it's definitely coming this year. So again, with these funds, we have until the end of 2024 to have them obligated. So I would just kind of hold off to see what ends up happening with that, and so that you can make the best use of these funds.
Okay. And then one last question, then we can move along. Is the broadband digital inclusion piece limited to households? Can these funds be used to provide hubs in communal locations?
Yes, it can be used for hubs and communal locations. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I also really wanted to I pulled this from National League of Cities as well, but I think it does a really great job of summarizing, kind of what I've put out here today, but to use dedicated grants and programs first whenever possible. Save these fiscal recovery funds for gaps and priorities not eligible for other federal and state assistance programs. So they give that example there of the FEMA's public assistance grant providing 100% reimbursement to local governments for premium pay. So there is also a cybersecurity fund. There is money for libraries and museums, humanities organizations, arts organizations. So I would be making sure that your communities are aware of those funds, as well as how to tap into them, so that once you can kind of see that those industries, those organizations were clearly affected by the pandemic, that they're getting the support that they need before you spend these funds on, maybe your water project or your revenue replacement. Assess your government operations and community needs by getting input from both your staff and stakeholders to create that comprehensive needs assessment. So really prioritizing planning, and then prioritize funding to ensure fiscal stability and returning your residents back to work, maintaining records and documents to create long-term information infrastructure for your future leaders. So I think that it says that the Treasury can audit a community for up to 20 years. So obviously there are going to be political changes in your community. So making sure that you preserve all of the information related to how you spent the money and your justifications for spending it, all of the reporting that you did, as well as SBOA is going to be auditing communities and how they spend these funds. So really making sure that that auditing and reporting piece is locked up and ready to go. And then ensuring that your congressional delegations are part of your success by involving them in ribbon cuttings, reopenings, and other ceremonies. I think that's a really great point that we often overlook, but the reason communities have received this flexible fund is because of our congressional delegation. So making sure that they're included as you celebrate those successes as well. And then I know I've thrown out a lot of information today, but I thought it would be good to summarize the really 3 key points. So we know that there is broad latitude with this fund related to pandemic relief needs. So the priority has also been given for underserved populations that were hardest hit by the pandemic. So we know that minority businesses, women-owned businesses were specifically very impacted by the pandemic, and also did not receive a large portion of the PPP funds. So is there an opportunity to reach out to those organizations that are in your communities or businesses that were in your communities and make sure that they have another opportunity to tap into the relief that they really need? Any recipient of these funds that fails to comply with a federal law would be required to repay the federal treasury. So making sure that your community is prioritizing tracking this, the guidance that we are receiving. I'll say that out of all of the organizations that are putting out information at this time, I've been really impressed with National League of Cities. They have been really transparent and putting out information. So that might be a good place if you're not already signed up to receive information, but to receive information from them. For our organizations that might be on the call that our Main Street organizations, National Main Street is doing a great job of finding the different pots of money within ARPA that could be used for our Main Streets. And so Jackie Swihart, who's our Main Street coordinator at Okra, has done a great job of conversing with them and making sure that we're distributing that information as well. But if you've got Main Street organizations, I would have them reach out to either me or Jackie so that they might be able to tap into the different funding within ARPA as well. And so this last one is kind of my piece, is that, this ARPA presents an opportunity to build the capacity of our local ecosystem and set communities up for the next several decades of economic and community development. You are encouraged to consider how investments will impact your entire community and should attempt to leverage this entire opportunity to increase future resiliency. So, there's speculations this is not the last disaster our communities will be facing. And so how do we set ourselves up to be resilient to those disasters in the future is going to be really key. And then the last piece before we do a poll is these are 3 pieces that I specifically copy and pasted from the interim final rule that I really wanted to hit home. But the Treasury is really, really emphasizing the importance of public input, transparency, and accountability. So I know that there is a strong desire to use these funds to do projects that were in maybe your recent comprehensive plan. However, I don't think that our communities today are not what they were prior to the pandemic. And so we really need to see how they have changed. And the only way to do that, I think, is to have our local leadership spend time asking their community how they were affected by the pandemic and what their needs are. I think our local leaders have done a great job of trying to track that, but I know it's been like drinking from a fire hose. And quite frankly, very overwhelming. But it is important going forward, and we have the time to do this with these funds, is to really ask our communities and try to target where funding is needed. And this is a great opportunity to do that. So reflecting the need for transparency and accountability within your community. So I know you're going to be getting, if you aren't already receiving, calls asking you how you plan on spending these funds. I think at this time, rather than, kind of relenting to the public pressure and saying, we're going to put it to our water project, because that seems like a pretty safe bet, I would say, back off and say, hey, we plan on doing a really extensive public input process. I saw in Greensboro, North Carolina, they did a really short, but it's called public budgeting, and they give the 3 areas of, I think actually, yes, it is just 3 of the 4 areas, and very generally. So they don't even say that's for their ARPA funds, but it says, do you think that we should be putting money to our healthcare workers? Should we be putting it to childcare? And so by doing that kind of quick public budgeting, maybe you only take 10% of the funds that you're receiving, but you did this public budgeting process to find out where the greatest need is and put those funds to that need. So I think you're totally safe to say, like, we're being strategic about it. We have time to spend it. We're not just going to spend it on whatever the safest, what we believe the safest use would be. I think, really taking the time to assess and be transparent about how you plan on spending those funds is important. So also engaging your constituents and communities and developing the plans to use these payments, given the scale of funding and its potential to catalyze broader economic recovery. So that is all I have at this time. I know that was a lot.
Well, I know that we're going to put up the poll. So while we're doing
Yes.
that, let's answer a few more questions.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with one that might be the easiest. Who decides how the funds are spent in counties, council or commissioners?
Commissioners technically get to make the plan, and then the council allocates the funds. They are the fiscal body.
Okay. Do you have a list of other funds, FEMA, et cetera, that could overlap in a doc for local leaders?
Yes, that would be that Bruce Katz document, as well as the spreadsheet that is on NLC's website.
Okay. We have 2 questions that are somewhat similar. So I'm going to ask if you could, generally speaking, I'm going to read the question from the beginning. The pandemic underscored our local need to diversify the types of employment available. So we are working to foster quality, future-focused jobs through our emerging tech sectors. Generally speaking, what would fall within acceptable uses for funds in industry cluster development? And there's more to that question because we've also been asked about programs that chambers and economic development groups could approach their municipalities with. And I thought maybe since those seem tied together, you might want to answer them together.
That's a great question. And I'm trying to think of the best way to answer it subjectively.
If you would like, you could possibly answer that in writing and we could pass that on to the participants if that would
Yeah,
be.
that would be great.
Okay. And then, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just thinking like, so yes, these funds really are broad. And if you can tie the what you are planning to do to the pandemic, I think you are, based on what we have seen with, you know, this specific guidance, that's not to say it won't change before the final guidance, especially with, you know, as they receive comment and requests for more information, that it won't change. But it does seem like at this time, if you can tie it to a pandemic need, you should be fine.
Okay, and then as our final question, well, actually, we just had another one pop in, but I'm going to ask you this one. Could Andrea give a couple of examples of possible projects she's heard mentioned in communities around the state that seem appropriate to you?
Yeah, so I think most of what we are hearing right now is, and maybe that is related to the fact that we do wastewater, sewer and drinking water projects, I'm not sure, but is that that wastewater piece, sewer, drinking water, broadband projects seem to be really popular. It's easy. I do see the ease of putting it to a wastewater, drinking water, sewer project because that does impact your whole population. So it is equitable in that way. But also seeing, you know, more support for our small businesses that were, you know, disproportionately affected by the pandemic. I think one of the other creative ways, maybe not so much creative, but one of the biggest, you know, one of the industries that was not included in CARES Act relief funding was that tourism industry, the hospitality industry. And so very generally being able to support, you know, our visitors bureaus or, you know, anybody who provides those services does have an opportunity to tap into these funds. So I think we're just kind of hearing people are starting to percolate on how they can use the funds at this time.
Okay, then we'll make this our final question.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know when final guidance will be shared?
We do not know. However, it should be around that July 16th deadline, but that might not even be the final guidance. That might be more interim guidance. We saw this even with the CARES Act funding. We received, I think it was like 5 or 7 different pieces of interim guidance before we got final guidance. So it's really hard saying.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yep. So did we get the results of our poll?
There we are.
Awesome. Thank you for doing this. I think I really am interested to see where communities are at with this. I think you know, some of them have been quick to make plans. Others are really not understanding how they even receive the funds or what the funds can be used for. And so we really want to help them understand what this opportunity is, because it is once in a lifetime. You know, the kind of the big talking point is that we haven't seen this level of federal funding to support local communities since the New Deal. So this is your time. This is your once in a generation opportunity to receive this kind of direct federal influx of funds. So thank you. I'll also, before we close, just add that you know, our agency is working on creating a program through our partnerships with Ball State University, Purdue Center for Regional Development, and IU Center for Rural Engagement. we are working on creating a program that will help communities both plan for and kind of tap into these federal funds. So that should be announced within the next 6 weeks or so. Just kind of trying to work out all of the details for that, but it will be based heavily on planning and community engagement. Those are huge priorities for our agency, and so we're seeking to support communities to go through that process.
Okay.
Andrea, I want to say thank you. This has been incredibly helpful. Really appreciate that you've taken the time to go into this level of detail with us. I do want to ask if people have questions for you, would you like us to forward them to you, or can they reach out to you directly?
Either works for me. Yep, I put my email and my phone number up here. You're more than welcome to email or call me.
Okay, great. Really appreciate that and look forward to the additional guidance that's coming out for everybody. I do want to say that we are fortunate in this region that there have been a number of organizations over the last number of years that have been able to collect information, support communities in creating analyses and studies. And as I put in chat, we know that every community has a digital inclusion study that's just been completed. Later this week, ROI will be putting out a link to a speed test. We have an opportunity through a program with an organization called Geo Partners with some of our regions, ROI Radius, and some of our partners, including the Farm Bureau, to actually collect data premises by premises in our communities through a speed test to give us really great data about broadband for people that are thinking about including broadband in their plans. I do want to encourage you, if there's any way that either Regional Opportunity Initiatives or Radius or OKRA or CRE can help you or can provide any information or data that we might already have, we're very happy to share that with you and provide whatever support we can as you're trying to put together your strategies for the American Rescue Plan dollars. As I mentioned earlier, we are also thinking as a region about READY and how the state's READY initiative can provide another source that complements what's available through the American Rescue Plan and other opportunities. And we will be coming to each county in the region in the month of June to talk about, just to listen and talk about what kind of opportunities we have in each county to take advantage of that program that's coming our way as well. So I thank all of you for making the time for this. I think Andrea did a really great job. She told us she's never done this in less than an hour. So she was super effective, and y'all asked very good questions that were very pointed and I think really helped this along. So again, thank you so much. Really appreciate everyone being here. Please don't hesitate to reach out if we can help you. And happy June.